This is my presentation about the legal and ethical issues behind sport and exercise science research. Ethical and legal are similar, but for sports science research, they need to be more definite. For example, legal means what's right within the law, whereas ethical is what is morally and ethically right. Before we look into the issues that can stop research or prevent it, let's take a look at the history of the laws and regulations and the reasons why it is now such a big part of the participants' health considerations. Starting in the concentration camps in the war, the Nazis conducted scientific experiments with the people in the concentration camps. Without any human considerations, they experimented on things like submerging the subjects in freezing water to discover how to prevent and treat hypothermia. They all led to some form of mental or physical harm, and some of them even caused deaths. They were all carried out without informed consent of the participant and were forced into doing them. They also thought the experiment had no right to withdraw at any point, even if it meant that it would cause them to die. Clearly, these are not ethically or legally correct or allowed. This is why the code came into practice. Then in 1947, the Nuremberg Code became the law for any research. The Nuremberg Code came into place in 1947. It is the code that researchers should abide by when conducting human experimentation to avoid any legal or ethical issues. And the 10 points of the code are displayed on the screen. The aim of this experiment, the Philip Zimbardo Stanford and the Stanford Prison Experiment, was to investigate how readily people would conform to the roles of the guard and a prisoner in a role-playing exercise that stimulated prison life. Zimbardo was interested in finding out whether the brutality reported among the guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards, or whether it had more to do with the environment. The guards started treating the prisoners really horribly, and the prisoners then cracked and they were breaking the rules, barricading themselves in and causing mental harm. That's why it became so morally wrong that they eventually had to stop the experiment. The Stanley Milgram experiment was to measure the willingness of the participants to inflict pain and harm mentally and physically, a mental and physical harm to the participant on the other side of the wall. That wasn't actually going to happen, but it was psychologically told to them because they were in a white coat that they were going to do it. They were being told to apply different levels of voltage when told to by the trained scientist. This then gave the participant, supposedly on the other side of the wall, a shock because they were told to do so by a so-called white coat syndrome, like I said earlier, meaning that they have very high levels of authority and that they should do as they are told. The study showed that unexpectedly a very high proportion of the people were willing to obey to the authoritative figure, even if apparently causing serious injury or stress, even though no one was being injured. The Declaration for Helsinki and the World Health Organization came up with a declaration in 1964 for the medical community. This is a set of ethical regulations which need to be considered during human investigations. Informed consent means that they have to be informed of the aims, methods and sources of funding. They must have the right to refuse at any point, and the informed consent process should be given. Then if there is a non-written consent, then it needs to be documented and witnessed. Therefore, if the participant is not able to give consent, then a physician needs to seek a legal authorized representation. BASIS are the British Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, who developed a code of conduct that all researchers have to follow when constructing their experiments. They also need to consider these when planning research too. For example, it includes things like informed consent, data protection, and ethical clearance. I've created 4 scenarios to help explain why researchers in sports and sports science need to consider these legal and ethical issues. My first scenario, a college student has been sent by the college to a GB gymnastics club to conduct an experiment on how power can link to performance. She was not given any instructions and had to conduct and plan the experiment by herself. She had no training and is not qualified to conduct any form of research. The participants were not willing to take part, so she had no choice but to select a few of them who didn't necessarily want to do it. Therefore, there are many legal and ethical issues here. Firstly, she has no training and she's just a young college student. This goes against the Nuremberg Code, saying that experiments should only be carried out by qualified persons. Secondly, there was no informed consent from the participants. This is vital, especially when dealing with children under the age of 18, because they need to have verbal or written consent from a parent or a legal guardian. The subject did not have a choice whether to participate or not, so this is therefore another ethical issue. The main issues were that the experiment that she had done no ethical clearance and had breached BASI's code of conduct, that there was no voluntary consent or withdrawal allowed. Therefore, prior to her study, she should have applied for ethical clearance. This needs to include the right to withdraw, voluntary consent and legal guardian signature. This document involves all of the ethical issues that could possibly be forgotten about. Therefore, it needs to be completed and then no mistakes could be made. If large ethical and legal mistakes were made, then there is a chance that the researcher could be fined. They could also lose their BASI's accreditation, if they had any, meaning that they would be banned from conducting any research for a while or forever, depending on the extremity of the issues. My next scenario includes a college student who wants to conduct an experiment to see how the height of the performer can affect the performance and the power of a gymnast. He has turned up to the gymnastics club in a suit and has brought 2 of his friends from college with him. He is studying sports science at college, but he's only 18. He has started explaining the experiment and has set up, and his phone rings and has to go home to fetch something for the experiment. This is wrong because he's leaving children under the age of 18 unsupervised, which therefore goes against the health and safety regulations. He also does not allow any of them to withdraw at any time because he wants to get his experiment over and done with quickly, so he doesn't want any sudden changes, therefore going against BASI's code of conduct and the ethical clearance. By him not giving them the right to withdraw breaches ethical clearance process, of which he has clearly not obeyed. He should have applied for ethical clearance and gone through the process before the experiment. This could cause him to be banned from conducting any kind of experiment in the future from BASI's. It may also cause him to pay a fine. He should also have had permission for the college to be able to take time out of lessons and for his friends to take time out. My third scenario is about Gemma and her 3 friends. They are part of a GB gymnastics team. Gemma is 16 years old and has sustained a neck and head injury whilst performing vault. Another club coach is experimenting new things on different clubs to see how he can train his gymnasts, and has decided to visit Gemma's club. He wants the 3 gymnasts to see how he wants to use the 3 gymnasts to experiment how many tumble rolls they can do before a training session compared to how many they can do after a training session. Gemma's coach has told the temporary coach that she is unable to partake in any experiments or any training that involves her neck because of her injury, but the temporary coach and her coach have insisted that she partakes even though it's 2 months early before she should return to training anyway. While some aspects of her training session have been progressing well, she has not overcome her fear of vaulting. Gemma's parents do not agree that this is appropriate, as it is going against medical advice. It has caused her relationship with her coach to become strained, and the temporary coach. So they have got in touch with GB Regional Performance Committee. The key issues with this is that before returning to training, the athlete should be asymptomatic physically, behaviourally and cognitively. Gemma should cease gymnastics training whilst waiting for a neuropsychological reassessment. Gemma's coach has also breached coaching ethics by allowing Gemma to return to training against medical advice. Both the coach's attitude towards getting Gemma back competing, and Gemma's inability to deal with her injury psychologically indicates an outcome driving coaching environment. Scenario 4 is a 17-year-old gymnast who has been using an experiment to see the relationship between how having a stronger cardiovascular system can improve the gymnast's floor routine performance. She has not previously had a health questionnaire prior to the experiment, and she has never used a treadmill before, and has not been fully briefed about what the experiment involves. All of her information has not been stored in a safe cabinet or a folder or on a computer. It has been remembered by the researcher and only put into the notes on his phone. Therefore, going against the Data Protection Act of 1998, which clearly states that it needs to be stored privately on a computer or in a locked file cabinet. The gymnast then suddenly feels weak and ill and wants to stop, but he insists that she carries on. He then posts her results from this test into the GB Gymnastics forum page for all to see. Key issues: medical questionnaire is key for cardiovascular system cardiovascular experiments, as the researcher knows nothing about whether she has any conditions, illnesses, or injury. By not having a medical check or a disclaimer means that the researcher is not protected against anything that may happen to the gymnast during the experiment. By the athlete continually asking to stop means that the researcher is not obeying the athletes to have the right to withdraw. This can be a part of the disclaimer, which therefore goes against the ethical clearance. Lastly, Data Protection Act 1998 states that all information needs to be locked away or stored, so it's breached that also. Thank you very much.